Welcome to Beyond the Qubit. My name is Frank Dekker and I'm your host. Today's guest is Koen Groenland, physicist, author of Introduction to Quantum Computing for Business and coordinator of startup hub Quantum Amsterdam. His focus is on quantum software. Koen works at the intersection of academia and entrepreneurship, helping to translate quantum research into real-world applications through Quantum Amsterdam. Before we start with the podcast, I have an important disclosure. This is a personal podcast and I do not represent any organization out there. Welcome, Koen.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you introduce yourself? Can you explain your background? What lessons from the past have shaped you?
Yeah, absolutely. I work at the University of Amsterdam in a role that we call Innovation Officer, and I'll explain a bit more what that means. But first, as my background, I really come from the academic side. I did a PhD at Centrum Wiskunde en Informatica, which is a scientific institute in Amsterdam. And when I started, a new institute was just founded, which is called QSoft. It might sound like a software company, but it's not. It's really a scientific institute with a main purpose to research quantum algorithms and quantum information. So I studied what we can possibly do with the small, limited quantum computers that are available today, which of course is really interesting and still very relevant today. I got my PhD there, and over the past 5 years, I looked more at the commercial side of quantum computing. We have, I think, two goals. One of them is to push all the great inventions that we have in academia, push them to the real world, get them from a scientific paper that nobody can read into something that people can actually use. And secondly, we have a goal to make the ecosystem here bigger. We hope to have more startups, more companies that are using quantum computers in a positive way, make sure that in the Netherlands we have highly educated staff, make sure that many people can find a job here, make sure that revenue is generated here, make sure that maybe as Amsterdam or the Netherlands we have a leading position in this field. So this would be our dream for maybe the next 10 years, that we will grow to be one of the most important locations in the world when it comes to quantum technology.
Okay, thank you, Koen. But can you maybe explain a little bit about yourself first? So have there been specific events or things that drove lessons from you from the past? What are the key things that shaped your personality and your character?
That's a great question. I think coming from the academic side, I noticed that there are, in terms of quantum computing, there's two kind of different worlds. There's the academics, which tend to be kind of cautious and careful. They don't want to make overly optimistic predictions. And then there's people that work at companies. They often have to convince investors, and they often sketch a very positive picture. And I think one of the things that taught me the most is being part of both of these communities and being able to interpolate between them. Well, I think that academics will say that quantum computers are still very far away. There are a couple of companies that will claim that you can already do useful things with quantum computers. And I think the truth is somewhere in between.
And other lessons that you can give? So I think that the fact that you come from an academic background and that you look now at the more optimistic way of, okay, how can we use the academics? That is one thing that learned and shaped you. But can you elaborate on do you have a bottom-up story, an experience from the past that shaped your character and your personality? And that helps you in your job today?
Yes. I can probably share a nice anecdote, coming from the academic side. When I was a student, almost ready to graduate, I was used to working hard, putting a lot of effort into everything. I was a kind of student that tried to get really good grades. And at some point, I was in a project together with somebody. We were just preparing for a final presentation. We still had a lot of work to do. And the person I was working with was like, well, I need to get a haircut. Maybe I should just go and do that. And my first response was like, that's crazy. I would never do that right before a presentation. You could still do so much work. But maybe it was a weird day. I was like, okay, sure, I'll roll with it. So we both went to get a haircut together, which was quite funny. And we nailed the presentation. It went fantastically well. We were maybe a bit more relaxed or so. I don't know. And this was maybe a bit of a switch for me where I thought like, hey, maybe always putting an infinite amount of work into something isn't the best thing to do. Sometimes it's good to be on the side of, I wouldn't call it the lazy people, but the best choice is almost never to put the maximum amount of work in something. You sometimes just want to work smarter. And sometimes it's actually genuinely a good thing to relax a bit, think more about good relationships with people, having a fun time, rather than always being the perfectionist.
Wow, I have a bit of similar experience. In my work at APG, my co-PM, where I run the portfolio with, Henny Krauwels, he said, Frank, if you are relaxed, then you make the best investment decisions. When you work really hard and you're stressed, the probability that you make less good quality of decision is much higher. Okay. Koen, what was the moment when you thought quantum computers is really going to be big and I want to be part of this?
Well, I kind of rolled into this slowly. I can imagine that many people that are now entering the field had sort of a eureka moment. But already in 2012, when I was a student, I did a small project on quantum computing. So I slowly learned about it. Already back then, there were people that claimed that in just 5 years, we would have fantastic and useful quantum computers. Well, we know how history went. In 5 years later, 2017, we didn't have that yet. But I have to admit that in the past year, a lot has happened, right? Over the past 15 years, we saw how these predictions went. People were often overly optimistic. Some were comparing us to, for example, fusion technology, which is always 30 years away, we jokingly say. But I have to say, in the past couple of years, a lot of things has happened. And if you know, for example, Sabine Hossenfelder,
No, I don't know.
A science communicator that has a really good YouTube channel, she has always been a bit pessimistic about quantum computers, and I think rightfully so. But
This is the grumpy lady?
well, in her last video, I was amazed. Even she was optimistic, because right now we're at kind of a stage where hardware is becoming really good. We're really getting the stage where we nailed how to make a single accurate qubit. We're really good at combining multiple, and we're close to reaching really proper error correction. And at the same time, there have been very nice developments in software and error correction. So there was a recent paper by Craig Gidney from Google, who did fantastic work on figuring out how a quantum computer could be used to crack RSA encryption. And according to him, you would only need, let's say, 1 million qubits or so and a week of computation time. And bringing these two together, the hardware roadmaps that have always been a bit optimistic, but not too far off either, and these predictions of what we need to run a quantum algorithm, they really are getting closer together.
Wow.
So I do believe that this is an interesting time to live. We're really seeing this point where the hardware and the software are about to meet each other.
Okay, that's interesting. When you look at your PhD period or your work at QSoft, what are you most proud of?
When I was a PhD, the things I would be most proud of is publishing a paper, which is always a fantastic achievement. I know there's thousands of papers that get published every year, but when you do one yourself, that's a lot of work, and it's a very accomplishing experience. And also working with extremely talented people, you get to know many professors and the smartest people in the field. But if I look back, I think what I appreciate the most from my PhD is being able to speak the language, being able to very quickly look at a paper and see what people are doing there, see if it's really novel. So I think that being integrated in this community and being able to extract information from it, interpret information, and easily speak to any people that I want to, that is, I think, by far the most useful skill that I learned, and also one that I use every day.
Thank you for the answers. What do you see as the biggest misconception that people have about quantum technology?
That's a great question. And I think there are many, many misconceptions. Quantum computing is understandably a very complicated topic. If I had to pick one for this podcast, I would say that many people present quantum computers as just much faster hardware. who could just replace your classical computer with a quantum computer and you will solve everything much faster. And that's of course not true. I think quantum computers are incredibly slow computers, sort of surprisingly. I would say that quantum computers are probably 100 or 1,000 times slower than a regular computer. And then on top of that, they also make mistakes. So they have to account for that. They have to do error correction. And that adds another few orders of magnitude in slowness. So I hope that's sort of surprising for many people. And then you should ask the question, why are we even interested in these computers? And that's because they run new kinds of algorithms. Algorithms that you could not run on your laptop or a phone or even a supercomputer, a regular supercomputer. And the impact of algorithms is enormous. For example, if you look at this example of breaking RSA encryption, a regular computer cannot do this. That's the whole assumption. We use encryption every day. It would probably take hundreds of years to actually do this with the best classical computers that we have today. And a quantum computer could do this in a couple of days or a couple of hours. And that's just to sketch how important these algorithms are. If you run this algorithm even on a much slower quantum computer, you still have a massive speed up. And that's, I hope that this is a misconception that can be debunked for as many people as possible. Because if you look at the field in this way, it's much easier to understand what problems we have around quantum computers and what the important aspects are. I even find this so important that I wrote this book about this, Introduction to Quantum Computing for Business. And I think the main point of this book is that we need to understand the impact of quantum algorithms a lot better.
I've bought the book, I've read it, and I've thought it was really useful. So I can recommend everybody to go through the book of Koen. Where can people find the book, Koen?
In
if
Europe,
you're interested in it?
Absolutely. It's freely available online. If you go to introtoquantum.org, you can read it for free. You can download the PDF, but you can also buy the paperback in any large bookstore.
I bought the paperback to support you. I think you did a great job.
Yes.
And I like to have the paperback. So maybe a short recap. You said, okay, one of the common mistakes is that people expect that quantum computers are really fast, but actually they're really slow. But it's almost, you said, like software eats the world. You didn't say that, but you said, okay, with quantum algorithms, you can really make a change. Maybe a sidestep. What is a quantum algorithm and how does it differ from normal algorithms?
That's a great question. And thanks for making time for these questions, because if you look at regular news coverage, I think they try to avoid the word algorithm because it sounds a bit daunting, right? It sounds a bit scary. So what for me is an algorithm is very simple. It's a step-by-step list of instructions that will help you solve a problem. And the first algorithm we already learned at elementary school, when you have to add two numbers together, let's say 1026 and 115 or so, you use an algorithm to add these numbers typically, if you do it on paper, right? You write them on top of each other, one number above the other, and first you add the digits that represents the ones, and then the tens, and then the hundreds, and then the thousands. And this works amazingly well. If I give you an incredibly large number, maybe a number with 100 digits, that's a ridiculously large number. That's way bigger than anything you ever encounter in a regular life or even in science. And you can add them by hand in maybe a minute or 2 minutes or so. So this trick, this step-by-step way of solving this problem, that is the algorithm. And of course, we also found algorithms to, for example, find the shortest path between two different locations, or maybe to crack encryption, or to simulate a molecule, or to simulate an airplane wing. That's all based on algorithms. And the better the algorithm, the fewer steps it takes you to solve it, so the faster you can solve your problem.
What is the difference between a traditional algorithm and a quantum algorithm? So if you have an algorithm on CPU or on GPU, why is that different from an algorithm in quantum computing?
Well, in many ways, they're not so different. They are both step-by-step instructions that a computer should do. But a quantum algorithm can actually use more instructions, more steps that a classical computer cannot do. For example, you can ask a quantum algorithm to make a quantum superposition. You can ask it to create a state where a bit or a register that represents a number, it can be two different things at the same time. And somewhat surprisingly, that actually gives you a bigger solution space. We can make more algorithms that way, and some of them turn out to be useful. Definitely not all of them, but some of them are.
And my next interview is with Amir Nafi from Classic.io. And he said, yeah, Frank, it is writing algorithms. It's almost like writing an LLM before ChatGPT was out. It's difficult. So how do you do that?
I think the difference is especially because we don't have these computers yet, right? So you cannot just test these algorithms. And maybe it's nice to distinguish between two types of algorithms. For example, the algorithm that I use to add large numbers, that's one where we can prove that it always works. So you don't even need to have a computer to test it. You can really see, you can mathematically prove that it works. And the same is true, for example, if you want to find the shortest path between two locations. And large language models are an interesting example because they're in this other category where we don't really know why they work. We cannot prove how long it takes for them to solve a problem. We just experimented and we empirically discovered that large language models work surprisingly well. So in this case, you could say the transformer, the T in ChatGPT, that is the algorithm. We could have used hundreds of different solutions, but it happens to be the case that transformers do this job so well. And I'm afraid that, well, maybe there's an interesting situation now, because for quantum computers, we have a couple of provable algorithms, but we're not super happy with the amount that we have found so far. If you look at the algorithms that we understand today, I don't think quantum computers would be that useful. But of course, we hope that when we have these large quantum computers, we will experiment with it, and we will also find the ChatGPT for quantum computers. We will discover new algorithms for which we cannot prove that they work, but by just experimenting, we'll discover that they work and do fantastically well.
I want to park this topic. We come back to it later. First of all, I want to know a little bit, what are you researching now? And why is this topic that you research, why is it important, and why are you motivated to work on it?
I kind of have multiple hats, so I think it's nice to mention two different things that I'm researching.
Yes,
one of them is very technical. One of them is about quantum key distribution. So that's a use case where we use a quantum internet. We need to have a glass fiber or so in the ground over which we can send qubits. And if you can do that, you can form sort of an add-on layer for cybersecurity. In fact, you can establish keys between remote parties where otherwise you might send a courier or so with a suitcase full of codes and bring that to somewhere else. And that has the quantum key distribution has a big flaw because it assumes that you already sort of identified who is on the other side of the line. Who are you talking with? And that's already a fundamental problem in cryptography that is kind of hard to solve if you want to have the same security guarantees that quantum key distribution offers.
I don't really understand that. Why is that? So why is it a flaw that you need to know who is on the other side?
Well, the biggest risk is a man-in-the-middle attack. So assume that we believe that we're talking to each other in this podcast now. It could be that there's somebody in the middle that is just relaying our voice. And they could, if they want to, maybe insert misinformation or change anything about what we say. Of course, for voice, that's a bit hard. But if you're just sending text messages or emails, that is definitely plausible. And if we're trying to negotiate a key remotely, now that really becomes a big problem.
Yes.
It would really be a problem if...
We have to make sure that it's really between you and me. That's the first. Now I'm with you. We also had Qbert on the show, Ingrid Romein.
Fantastic. Yeah, they're actually building this quantum key distribution technology.
Yes. And she explained about the hubs technology, so how they were differentiated. That is not like the ending and the receiving party, but they had a hub in the middle, and that makes sure that... But
Yeah,
what
what's beautiful about what Qbert does is that this hub doesn't need to be trusted. They don't need to identify themselves. You can recognize that they're doing their job from the outside. But still, the people that want to establish the keys, they need to make sure that they are establishing a key with the right person. And there's many ways to do this. None of them is perfect. And we're trying to find an alternative way to do this where we use the actual quantum connection itself.
how does that work?
I don't think I should go into too many details here, but you should really see this as we have this quantum connection anyway. So we're going to use this quantum connection both to establish a key and to check who is on the other side at the same time. And this will be at the cost of performance, so we need to send more photons. But in exchange, you have much better security in regards to knowing for sure who is on the other side of the line.
What I really liked about Qbert was the idea that you have a central hub. And with the central hub, you reduce the amount of cost. Because if every individual needs a transceiver and a receiver, then the cost increases significantly when the network grows. Whereas with a hub, you can put in a central location, let's say a data center, you can put in the equipment. How would that work for the technology that you are researching? Is it in the end node, the intelligence, or is it in a hub?
Our goal is to make sure that it works with standard point-to-point quantum key distribution. So whether it works with the kind that Qbert uses, I think I still have to find out whether it works for that system. But for the kind of standard QKD systems that most vendors are selling, our goal is that it should just work with the current hardware. So the kind of QKD devices that, for example, a Toshiba or a VeryCloud is selling today.
Yes, okay. And basically, I think you make an entanglement and a superposition, and because of that, then you know it is so how do you make sure that you know that you're speaking to the right person?
Should we really go into the technical details of that?
I love the technicals, Koen.
Okay, let's give it a shot. Okay. So if you want to identify somebody on the internet, that's kind of a difficult task, right? You at least need to share something beforehand. Because if you don't share some secret beforehand, everybody on the internet is equivalent, right? I can ask you to maybe, I don't know, convince me that you are actually Frank. But anybody else on the internet could maybe give the same answer, unless you have a secret that nobody else knows. And in cryptography, the secret is probably a secret key, right? That's the way computers share secrets. So we already need a secret key to start with. That's a bit unfortunate. So that means that when you install a new device, for example, you need to put a secret on it manually. That's terrible. But in the best case scenario, you do this only once. And then from there on, you never have to touch the device again. And it can always identify itself. Now, there's a problem in regular quantum key distribution, which is as follows. I guess the main selling point of quantum key distribution is that they can do information theoretic security, which means that we can mathematically prove that the security is there. And this is different from the security that we typically use on the internet today. We cannot prove that it's secure. We just believe it's secure because many people tried to hack it, tried to crack it, and nobody managed to do it. And we might have other intuitive security ideas, but it's theoretically possible that somebody would crack all the encryption that we use today on a regular laptop. That's theoretically possible. So I think that's the main selling point of QKD. And if you want to use the same level of security for identification, you can use this key only once. The key that you put on your QKD device, for example. Now, that's unfortunate, right? Because either you need to constantly manually put new keys in it, or you happen to have a QKD device anyway, so you can keep using the keys that you generate anyway. So if your QKD device would generate, let's say, 1,000 bits of key, you might say, well, maybe I'm going to save the first 300 bits for the next time I need to do this identification process, and the remaining 700, we can send that to the end user. That's a good way to do that. But it gives other problems, because what if your QKD is interrupted? What if maybe there's an eavesdropper or somebody that simply blocks the connection or so? Then you still use this identification process. You used up all your key material, but you don't generate new key material. So you run out of your key at some point. And then again, somebody has to go back and manually put a new key in. And the beautiful thing is, if there are new identification methods where we use this quantum connection, where we can prevent this from happening. So we make sure that you never have this key exhaustion. You never run out of key. Or in fact, you can reuse the same key multiple times, even in this very demanding information theoretic setting. Now that sounds very technical, I guess, but I hope it makes sense that this has an addition, a sort of an added advantage, that you have great security and at the same time you never run out of key material.
Okay, thank you for explaining.
I probably have to say there's also a downside because we have to make other assumptions. For example, that opponents cannot store very quickly a large amount of quantum information. They cannot receive many qubits very quickly and store them. So there's a whole discussion about what you want to use. And I guess the answer is probably you want to use a hybrid, a combination of different technologies in the end.
Okay. With your research, what do you try to achieve on a 10-year basis?
I don't think I have a very concrete 10-year goal, but I thought about this a little bit. And of course, I have a couple of dreams that I would find fantastic if we could achieve them in the next 5 or 10 years. One of them, the example about quantum key distribution that I just gave, is one example of many technologies that we are looking at that we think, hey, these are great inventions. We want to take them out of the lab or out of an academic paper and bring them into practice. Make sure that somebody actually starts using them for what we intend them to be used for. So one of my dreams is that we have one or more inventions that are real breakthroughs and people will actually start using them. So this could be a great new piece of software that a startup can start using. It could be a patent. It could be a piece of open source software that people start using. I don't care what it is, as long as the stuff we do actually turns out to be incredibly useful. And maybe another dream that I would have is I make many predictions about how quantum computers will evolve, in what year we will start using quantum computers. So I'm extremely curious in 10 years how these predictions will turn out to be. Yes. I'm almost sure that they are wrong, but I just hope that they're not too much wrong.
Okay, now that makes a lot of sense. Coming back, maybe you said I have multiple hats on. So on one hand, one hat that you wear is your research on quantum key distribution. What are the other hats?
You might say that I have 3 different hats on. One of them is indeed as a researcher. So currently we're looking at quantum key distribution. I work at this institute called QSoft. So we still hope to make QSoft a very successful institute. We already are. But we want to do just slightly more than that. We want to not only publish fantastic papers, but also give something useful back to society. And maybe the most interesting hat for the purpose of this podcast is I've for a long time been coordinating the hub called Quantum Amsterdam, which has as a purpose to ensure that Amsterdam is leading in terms of quantum technology. And when I say Amsterdam, I mean the ecosystem of everybody that's working on cool quantum technology, the startups, the academics, also students, also teachers, also the end users, companies that might be interested. So our vision is that in 10 years, people will say, so you want to work on quantum technology? Sure. Then you need to go to the Netherlands. And then, of course, I hope they will first say Amsterdam. But if they would say Delft or Twente, I would also be perfectly happy with that.
But that's quite an interesting role. And I think what they have achieved so far in Delft, I think that's already quite amazing.
Absolutely.
And you're trying to promote another hub in Amsterdam. And I think Delft and Amsterdam are not too far away from each other. So I can see also some positive spillover effects.
Absolutely. Yeah, you should see the Netherlands more as the Netherlands is one large city, right? The train network is a bit like the metro that you would have in a large city like Los Angeles or London. Traveling between Amsterdam and Delft might take you less than an hour.
And what so far excites you most from what you have seen in the Amsterdam hub?
There's many things that excite me. I think we can be extremely proud that on the academic level, we are extremely strong. I think we have a couple of research groups that are top of the world. the groups that we have probably possess unique knowledge that's only there in a very small number of groups around the world. That's very special. But like many places in Europe, I think we're good at the academic side, but we can improve a lot when it comes to making it commercial. So I'm excited that we have a couple of really cool startups. I'm thinking of Fermionic, Quantum Gateway Foundation. I'm very happy that Quix also has an office in Amsterdam that is growing. But we can do a lot more, I think. And maybe that's the interesting side of my work. This is really a field where we need a lot of improvement. And I hope that over the next years, we'll see a lot more focus on commercialization of any quantum technology.
Okay, that sounds interesting. What developments see you in your field, and what impact will it have on the quantum technology?
Well, if I look at quantum computers, I think by far the most interesting developments I can point out are in hardware. There have been really cool improvements. For example, the bigger companies like IBM, QEra, Google, they have really shown how they can make increasingly complex and large quantum computers. They're easily building a couple of 100 qubits now. And building a couple of hundreds of qubits is already complicated, but making them play together, I think, is the most difficult task. So I really want to point at quantum error correction. That is, if you ask me, the biggest improvement that is taking place right now. And I think one of the big moonshot achievements that we can hopefully see in a couple of years is where people can make a logical qubit that can last for a very long time, almost indefinitely, at least billions of times longer than a single physical qubit would live. So this would be my prediction.
But also, Koen, the difficulty that I have is there are multiple technologies. Let's say where I believe in is that at 100 logical qubits, it's proven that quantum technology works and that you can start to do the first applications.
Absolutely.
But you have 3 building blocks. The first building block is the amount of qubits per chip. Then you have the amount of qubit chips in a cluster. And then you have the error correction ratio. If you look at superconducting computing, the amount of qubits per chip with chiplets can scale very high. But moving to clusters, that's a bit more difficult because you have the cryostat environment. But then the error correction ratio, there are significant improvements coming. But then if you look at photonics quantum computing, there the amount of qubits per chip is okay. Building clusters, quantum is really advanced in making clusters of qubit chips, but the error correction ratio is lagging. Then if you look at iron trapped, to scale the amount of qubits per chip is low. Forming big clusters is harder, but the error correction ratio is one of the best. So I think it's difficult to generalize across the technologies, but I think in a way it's also interesting that you have multiple technologies competing.
Absolutely.
How do you see this? So, and if you say I see improvements in error correction ratio, what technology do you mean, or do you mean general for all of them?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We have an incredibly interesting race between all these different hardware platforms. They all have their pros and cons. Like you said, superconducting qubits, I think, are right now the most established and most mature platform, but I guess putting multiple chips together is among the hardest for them. Ironically, I think the improvements to error correction, sometimes the improvements are so fundamental that they work for every platform. But also, if you zoom in a bit and look at the precise type of error correction that is used, it's most likely that, for example, superconducting qubit platforms will use different error correction than, say, cold atoms, simply because superconductors, the qubits are fixed in place. They can only talk to their neighbors. So you want to avoid doing any operation that involves faraway qubits. So for this example, we have the surface code. It's specifically designed to work with a square grid kind of configuration of qubits, where qubits only talk to their nearest neighbors. And there have been fantastic improvements in error correction. And if you look at these estimates of Craig Gidney, who says that we can crack RSA encryption in, let's say, a week, he looks specifically at surface codes. But theoretically, we can do much better than these surface codes. So there are, let me pronounce this correctly, quantum low density parity check codes. They involve these operations between faraway qubits. So that's unfortunate for superconducting platforms. But for most other platforms, this might be a much better way to do error correction. And which one will work better? Yeah, we'll have to see. It's an interesting race, and it's, I guess, good for everybody that we have multiple horses to bet on. And we'll see whichever works best in the end.
But with which platform do you think benefits most from the further away qubits, connecting them for the error correction?
I think photonics is an obvious one, where because these photons are just flying around, you can easily connect any photon to any photon, of course, with certain limitations, but I guess you can have a lot of creativity in how you do error correction there. But also, for example, in trapped ions and cold atoms, the atoms are a bit easier to move. So also there, I don't see any, I could see, for example, these low density parity check codes as one of the best candidates.
Interesting. When I interviewed Jan Goets from IQM, he mentioned that also IQM sees massive benefits in error correction. So now they're roughly 1,000 physical qubits for one logical qubit, but he was talking like an improvement of 20 times, like moving the error correction ratio to 50 to 100. He talked about an hybrid approach between the two that you mentioned. So the topological and I think the star, or it's in the IQM roadmap. But maybe to summarize, as you think, is that it's for superconducting qubits, it's harder because it are not moving qubits. Can you explain that a little bit? I didn't fully get that. Why is that?
I hope this is a relatively easy concept. These qubits, if you think of a regular computer, if I want to have one bit on my hard drive and another bit on my hard drive and compare them, my hard drive and my whole computer doesn't care, right? We can just fetch these qubits, they go into the CPU, and the CPU can act on them directly. So in a quantum computer, we cannot just fetch a bit and transport it. These bits are fixed in place. These qubits are, in the case of a superconducting qubit chip, they are literally at a certain location on the chip, and we don't have cables that transport them so easily. So the best kind of way we can work with them is to simply say all qubits are fixed and they're only going to talk to their immediate neighbors because there is some connection between qubits that sit close to each other. So also the error correction that we want to do on these platforms is most likely a type of error correction where we only need these immediate neighbor interactions. So it's very kind of a simple geometrical problem, you might say. And for cold atoms, we have really nice techniques. We call them tweezers made of light, and we can really pick up an atom and transport them wherever we like. So we can really pick up any two atoms that we like and bring them together. And that gives so many more possibilities. So theoretically, the error correction that we do on cold atoms could be a lot more efficient than the error correction that we do on superconducting qubits.
Wow.
Of course, these platforms have different downsides that we have to weigh against each other, so it's not immediately clear which one is better. But it's interesting that we can use different techniques on different types of platforms.
And on the scaling of the amount of qubits per chip for cold atoms, what are the limitations there?
I'm not a hardware expert here, but from what I hear from colleagues is cold atoms have a huge advantage because as far as I know, we're not reaching this limit. We're not anywhere near. So it's very plausible that we can easily put 1,000, maybe 10,000 of these atoms on a line. But also in 2 dimensions, we can easily make a grid of, let's say, 1,000 by 1,000 atoms. So the first million qubits or so of cold atoms, we can probably fit them into what you might call the same chip. There's technically no chip, but they will be in the same vacuum chamber. And theoretically, we could go into 3 dimensions. And that would give you access to even more qubits. So I would expect that for the next couple of years, cold atoms would not run into any trouble with regards to how many qubits or atoms they can fit into a single machine. For trapped ions, they have a sort of an opposite situation, right? Because the kind of traps that they use allow for, let's say, about 50 ions or 50 qubits. You can push it a bit. You can go to, let's say, 100, but this goes at the cost of, for example, gate fidelities. So the people that work on trapped ions are already figuring out how they can combine multiple traps, where I guess you can compare one trap to one chip or so. And then they need to connect them somehow. So are they going to take atoms out of one trap and move them into another? Or are they going to use light, entangled photons, to create entanglement between different chips, different traps? We still don't know what the best method is, but this is very interesting research that should push this further and make maybe trapped ions among the first that will combine multiple chips into a single computer.
Yes, and for investors, there's a lot of attention on trapped iron because ex-Honeywell, Continuum, is planning for an IPO second half of 2025. And so far what I heard from my network is they are testing the water. So, and the rumored IPO price is like 5 or 10 billion. So that's also a number that really matters for investors. So if they're paying attention. My concern would be that it's much harder to scale if you work with lasers and with magnets.
I can understand. We're not used to working with that technology compared to how we use integrated electronics on computers today.
Yes. Coming back, when do you expect the first quantum applications have impact on society?
That's a question I really like, and I guess the billion-dollar question that everybody wants to know. If you ask me, I made several predictions, which are based on very heavy assumptions. I'm going to assume that the number of qubits that we put on the chip is going to evolve a bit like Moore's law. So we have an exponential growth in the number of qubits that we can build, which is an assumption. I have no proof that this is going to happen. I'm going to assume that the first use cases will be in code breaking or simulation of chemistry, simulation of materials. And if I look at these numbers, I would say that in about 10 years, say 2035, that's roughly the range where we will see the first applications. But there's a big margin of error. So I would say if you would make sort of if you would plot the likeliness that you would see the first application per year, it would be a bit like a bell curve, but a very much spread out bell curve. There's a huge risk that this might already happen 5 years earlier. There's a huge risk that it might happen 5 years later. So I want to be careful, but this is the most accurate prediction that I can give today, I think.
What I also liked about your book is that you were cautious of being too optimistic and hyping the area. It felt like you really tried to be no nonsense and realistic. Yeah, so I thought that was interesting. Which applications do you think will have the most impact?
That's a big open question that I think is a lot harder to answer. We're often looking at applications in chemistry, where I picture that people that are currently doing computational chemistry, quantum chemistry on a classical computer, we hope to help these people, give them more tools, help them, for example, develop new types of batteries, find new types of medicine. So that's one category that I think we have good evidence that we have the right algorithms, quantum algorithms for that. But of course, the total economic impact is, well, still huge, but not as large as when we could potentially speed up, for example, machine learning or optimization or generic company problems. I would call it operations research. If we can have a significant improvement using quantum computers there, that would probably have a much bigger economic impact. But I have to say, we're much less sure about how good the quantum algorithms will be there. So that's a big risk. But if there's one area that will have a huge impact in the near future, that would be in encryption or breaking encryption. So already today, I think most investments that relate to quantum computing are going to ensuring that current cryptography on classical computers is getting an upgrade and that they will be secure against quantum computers in, let's say, 5 or 10 years from now.
And maybe, Koen, for your information, the feedback that I quite often get is if people hear I work on the podcast, hey Frank, but I have personal investments in crypto. Are those at risk? If encryption would be break, do you think that blockchain is at risk?
Well, blockchain is very closely...
Maybe the best risk, when is it at risk?
The risk for blockchain is not necessarily different than for, let's say, the cybersecurity of a company, at least in terms of how many years it's away. But yes, blockchain is very heavily dependent on what we call public key cryptography. For example, your bank account number effectively, that is effectively your public key. And a quantum computer can find the secret key that comes with this public key relatively easily. So when we have large quantum computers that can run Shor's algorithm, then many cryptocurrencies are at risk. And the amount of risk kind of depends on the way they approach things. For example, Deloitte did a bit of research on this, and Ethereum used a very smart trick where they, for example, hash the public keys before they make them public. And that kind of prevents most attacks. I would still recommend them to go to a new cryptographic method. They should use post-quantum cryptography that is secure against quantum computers. But for the time being, there's not so much risk. For Bitcoin, especially old addresses can easily be cracked. And I think if these old addresses are opened, that's also going to be very disturbing for the Bitcoin market. Some people are afraid of mining being impacted, but so far it seems that the impact of quantum computers on mining are very limited. It's really about breaking, like stealing somebody's secret key and stealing the money that's on a certain address.
And how easy is it to adopt for a blockchain or Ethereum for a post-quantum world?
How easy it is for them to migrate to a new system.
Yes, to say, okay, look, now there's new technology, so how can we adjust for that?
That is, I'm not a blockchain expert, but from what I hear, that's incredibly complicated because there needs to be consensus. So all miners need to agree with something. So it doesn't, especially Bitcoin is often said to be kind of conservative. So it's very likely that Bitcoin will be among the last to migrate. Maybe some others are more progressive. So if there is sufficient consensus, then in theory, from the software side, it would not be too much hassle to migrate. It's still a big problem. You need several experts to work on this, but it's definitely doable. But getting everybody along, I think that's the main challenge.